us, and we're very fortunate that we're able to bring Anya here and meet students at the best university in Brazil. So you're the best of our journalism students, and Anya is the best of our expert speakers on this topic as well. So with that, I'd like to welcome Anya. And well, first we'll welcome Elizabeth, who will provide welcoming remarks for Anya as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, boa noite. I'm going to speak in English or not Portuguese. Ok. Boa noite a todas e todos. É muito legal ver aqui o auditório lotadaço. Isto para o CJE é um marco, tá bom? Isso é muito legal, muito bom ver vocês aqui. Ainda vou cruzar com muitos de vocês em algum momento nesse semestre, na disciplina do Rodrigo. Mas, antes de tudo, queria parabenizar vocês por estarem aqui, por uma discussão que hoje é fundamental para quem trabalha com jornalismo, mídia, informação em geral e todo o processo de desinformação que a gente vem já, né, pelo menos há alguns anos, vivenciando. E entrar nesta temática de uma maneira via a professora Anya, que é da melhor universidade americana hoje, falando disso, acho que é um privilégio para todos nós. Então, eu queria agradecer muito a Anya, ao Consulado norte-americano, à Embaixada também, e fundamentalmente aqui a Jornalismo Jr, que colocou todo mundo aqui na plateia para discutir, ao professor Rodrigo Ratier, que quem criou todo esse processo e a possibilidade da gente ter isso aqui hoje, essa noite. Não esqueci de ninguém, os tradutores, né? A equipe técnica que está com o canal no YouTube, também vai depois transmitir e deixar isso bonitinho lá no YouTube. Então, ficam os agradecimentos aqui. A gente tem uma organização, primeiro a professora Anya vai fazer a apresentação dela em torno de 1h, 45 minutos, e depois a gente vai abrir para perguntas, e eu espero que vocês façam muitas perguntas. E, de novo, agradeço a Anya, agradeço ao consulado, e aproveitem.
Well, first, I want to say thank you for waiting for me. I was pretty horrified when all of a sudden they diverted the plane to a different airport, but very organized. Everyone's been really nice in Brazil. Found a taxi. Took 2 hours, and I'm so sorry I kept you waiting, but I'm glad I made it. And I'm impressed so many of you are here. My students on a rainy night probably wouldn't come out for a panel, so that's a lovely surprise. And again, thank you for hosting me to the university. Turns out Elizabeth and I already know each other from some of the fact-checking work. I've been to Brazil many times, and I was here for the Bragi Investigative Journalism Conference, I think in 2014, and also the Global Investigative Journalism Conference around the same time, 2013, 2014 in Rio. And I've had a lot of Brazilian journalists as my students over the years. And everybody has been so warm and trying to invite me to dinner and offering to come to Sao Paulo because everybody loves to come to Sao Paulo. So we've just been in Brasilia, and I've been talking a lot there about regulation of big tech. You have a lot of different controversial bills coming up. At the moment, everyone in the world is really following the two bills that you have now, which were one bill last spring to get platforms to help pay for news, the fake news bill. So I think that Brazil is known globally as a leader in tech regulation. So I'm very interested in that subject. So I can take questions about it, but I thought that tonight you might enjoy talking about AI, because I feel like everywhere I go, that's the subject people are thinking about, and all the journalism conferences. So I've prepared a presentation on AI and journalism, and it's not too long, maybe 30 minutes, and then I'm happy to talk about anything that you want to talk about. I'm a little worried that maybe people can't see it. Is it too light? I don't. Oh, wow, great. Thank you. That's much better, I think. And also, it's available for you, so if you want a copy of it, I'm very happy to share, and also my other PowerPoints. So anything you want, no problem. As I mentioned, everyone in the world is so worried about artificial intelligence and is it going to kill all the jobs? But whenever I go to a journalism conference, everybody's really excited about it. And I think that journalists have been using artificial intelligence or automated journalism for many, many decades. Associated Press and Bloomberg and Reuters all used it for sort of basic financial coverage. I don't know how, I started out at Dow Jones covering the stock market, gold, and that a lot of that stuff can be automated. And then, of course, sports reporting, anything where you're just saying, hey, who's winning, who's losing, what were the points, all of that stuff can be automated. And so the Washington Post and the Associated Press have used automated journalism for sports reporting. I think what was really transformative was the sudden arrival of ChatGPT. This being, I'm sure, how many of you are using it already for your homework? All right. At Columbia University, we're totally paralyzed. The semester just started last week. Everybody's saying, what's the policy? We have no idea. We are emailing each other all the time going, what are we going to do? And, in the beginning, of course, we thought, well, maybe we can ban it. And then we realized, no, we can't ban it. Forget that. That's over. So we're having a meeting in like 2 months to talk. Don't you love how slow universities are? In 2 months, we're going to have a meeting to discuss should we have a policy, right? So by the time we have a policy, we'll all be dead or something. I don't know. But anyway, all of a sudden, late 2022, ChatGPT comes along. Journalists are not slow like professors. They started using it immediately. Right. So we've now had all of these, BuzzFeed, Gizmodo, CNET, everyone started using it. And it's sort of the typical Silicon Valley way, which is you just get started. They always say, don't ask permission, say you're sorry later, except they don't really say they're sorry. So everyone just started using this stuff. It's a bit like Uber, basically. So that's where we are now. Thank you. We can go ahead. So first of all, the World Association of Newspapers in May. By the way, this is my second time with this PowerPoint. I prepared it for Brazil, so hopefully we could, I hope it works. But the good thing is it's very fresh. So yeah, in May 2023, World Association of Newspapers did a survey of their members and found that half are already using AI in their newsrooms. And then you can see what percentage of journalists are using ChatGPT on at least a weekly basis. And the answer is, I think they said maybe 40%. 40%? I don't really understand that chart, but anyway. It's not clear to me, is that 40% are or 5% are? Anyway, I have to go back, and you'll have to go back and look at the original source, and I will have to fix this for my next PowerPoint. Anyway, point being, everyone's using it, and there are no guidelines in most places. So we're going to talk a little bit about the guidelines. Thank you. Next. And there's already been lots of embarrassing experiences. So I don't know if you've seen that Gizmodo wrote an article that had loads of mistakes in it. CNET ended up plagiarizing by mistake. BuzzFeed made quizzes that didn't work. We've also in the US had the case of a lawyer who used ChatGPT for precedence. He was working for one of the airlines, and we all hate the airlines because they're so slow and they cancel so many flights and they got so much money in the pandemic. So he was using ChatGPT in a case defending the airlines, and it turned out ChatGPT invented all of the precedents. You right? Some of you are nodding. You know about this. And the judge said, what is that? So, lesson number one is, how many of you, when you're using ChatGPT, you're checking it? Oh my God, you are in danger of making terrible mistakes in a journalism school. So check it. Okay, next please. Possibly the most embarrassing. I told all my friends I was coming to Brazil, and they all told me great stories. And maybe the most embarrassing story I heard was the Irish Times in May had to apologize. They ran an entire fake op-ed. And it was an op-ed about, accusing Irish women of being really racist for using suntan cream. And the op-ed appeared in the Irish Times, respectable, prestigious Irish newspaper, said she was from Ecuador. Turned out the whole thing was done by a college kid who used ChatGPT. Entire thing completely fake. So, we journalists, part of the whole disinformation problem is journalists worry that people don't trust quality information. And if we're going around starting to publish all these things that are completely BS, bogus, without checking them, it's going to really hurt the credibility of journalism and the trust in journalism. So we're going to need, you still have jobs, I hope you'll still have jobs, because we're going to need people to monitor it very closely. Okay. So far, we've started to see a few newspapers, media outlets, come up with guidelines for using AI in the newsroom. And mostly, they're looking at things like what I just mentioned, which is human oversight and transparency, right? We don't want to lie to our audiences about what we're giving them. So that's going to be very important. Just like when you turn in homework that's been done with a ChatGPT, are you saying that to your teacher? Are you putting a little note at the bottom? No? Do you have a policy about that? I think you're going to need a disclosure policy. I think so. And that's what I'm telling my students. I don't want to edit something that's written by generative AI. That's a total waste of my time. So if you're going to use it, let me know so I won't bother editing you. Thank you very much. So then there's all these other questions. We don't want to journalists shouldn't start giving away audience data to the AI platforms, which could easily start happening. And then who's responsible? Right? If the generative AI, they're already being sued in the U.S., right? If generative AI defames somebody or tells a lie about somebody, who do you sue? Newspapers, media outlets, there's a real person. And in the U.S., I think the courts have already determined that AI does not have exemption from liability. So they can, these companies can be held liable. And then, of course, everybody's worried about the scope for bias in generative AI tools as well. So those are all some of the things people are talking about. The Guardian guidelines are focused on things like how journalists can use AI. So that's, of course, things like combing through large data sets. When you think of something like the Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, massive leaks, generative AI is going to be extremely useful for filtering through all of that. But it's going to be really important to explain, what was done artificially and what was done by a person. So that's part of what the Guardian newspaper is focusing on. Next. The Associated Press, in the end of July, came up with guidelines for writing about AI, for covering AI. And one of the things that they said was, let's not do too many stories about how it's going to transform society. Let's actually stay focused on what these models are, how they're being used, how well they perform, who's benefiting and who's making money. Journalists always ask that question, right? Whether it's a trade agreement or new technology, and who could be negatively impacted by such tools. So I do recommend that you take a look at the AP guidelines. They're very extensive and they're actually very interesting. I don't know, are there Brazilian media houses that have come up with guidelines yet for using generative AI? No? All the journalists I talked to in Brasilia said no. So I've got a hand up.
There's a journalism startup grupo that has a AI guideline, but it's a small company.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
There's some not public guidelines at where I work, but they have informed us how we can use it.
They have informed you.
Yeah, and we had a panel about different options of IA. Because there's also, you mentioned like ChatGPT doesn't give you reference.
Yeah.
You can check, but there's like Perplexit that gives you.
Yeah.
You can, search in the internet for other links and
Yes.
it can mention to you. So, yeah.
So you're allowed to use those?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to check.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, I was, the other day I was looking, I'm very interested, as you know, and this is a side point, about bargaining codes and getting Google and Meta to help pay for news, to pay publishers. And so I was looking on Bing the other day. Well, first of all, I looked on Google, this is totally a side point, to see the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, which makes Google and Meta pay for news in Australia. And Google wouldn't even give me that information. They just gave me their blog post saying how bad it was. And then I went to Bing, and they had 5 links, just like you're mentioning, and 2 of them were articles I had written. So I thought, okay, they don't have that much information yet, basically, if there's yeah. So anyway, so good. So I'm on a Reporters Without Borders task force, and we're developing guidelines that newsrooms around the world can use if they want to, when they design their own guidelines on AI use. And Maria Ressa, the Filipina Nobel laureate, founder of Rappler, is the chair of this group. And we're trying to come up with some principles by the end of the year. And we're actually, maybe before, they might launch it in November in Paris. And so we're in 4 groups right now. So information gathering, information processing, information dissemination, and then strategic positioning, which really means money, which we're going to talk about later, how journalists should be able to benefit from this. Yeah. And I think that you know how the French love to come up with big, complicated frameworks, which is why I love the French. I'm half French. So they're trying to come up with this framework that will work for the next 15 years, no matter what happens. And I keep thinking, oh gosh, that's going to be really hard because everything will change pretty quickly. And I've been thinking more along the lines of sort of classical journalistic principles of ethics and transparency and fairness. But they're also thinking, we're also talking about what's actually different about AI. But we're thinking about sort of the trends that are going to happen, what can we use, what will be useful in the future, and, what kind of systems do we need to think about, and incentives, and of course, again, very French, the precautionary principle. So what could be the harms, and how can we mitigate against them ahead of time? So that's some of the stuff that we're doing. And hopefully we'll have that ready soon. And we have a terrific rapporteur, so he's already putting together loads and loads of possible solutions that we may want to incorporate. So authenticity standards, transparency standards, again, all the things we've been talking about, proofreading and making sure that the text is authenticated, ethics standards, prohibiting hyper-personalization, which everybody's very, very worried about. We'll talk about that more when we come to disinformation and echo chambers, and then collaboration. How can we want to make sure that there's a liability regime, but also we don't want random open source models training outside of agreements, and we'll talk more about that. But that could end up being very risky, and that's already a tension because the large companies that are doing this, the large language models, are already trying to keep out everybody else. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Anybody know how much it costs to build a reliable large language model? I was told last week that it's $100 million, and that's why there's only 7 of them. Yeah, that we'll come back to that. Yes, go ahead. So how is this going to affect we've talked a little bit about how AI is affecting the production of news. How is it going to affect the relationship between journalists and management? And obviously one big worry is livelihood and jobs. Right, you've seen the Hollywood writers' strike, the fights in Brazil over copyright. There's so many implications, right? If the large language models train on, as somebody, I was reading the paper the other day, 20 Danielle Steele novels, then they decide they want to write their own novel. What happens then? Whose work is it? Who gets paid for it? Who's at fault if there's liability issues? So this is a big part of the fight that's happening right now in Hollywood, and some of the newspapers as well are already having arguments about all of this. And I've already been hearing in Brazil journalists saying, "What about us? We don't get very big salaries, so what about this? Do we get any money off this?" Next. Bild. Best-selling tabloid in Europe, best-selling outlet in Europe, has already fired 200 journalists, saying partly economic downturn, partly AI. CEO, lovely man, said, AI is going to be better at aggregation of information than journalists are, than people are. So that's really a big fear for everybody. Go ahead. And then relatedly is the business model of digital news. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So as I mentioned, I've been very interested in following closely Australia's competition commission, which has pushed Google and Facebook to pay for news. And as we know, around the world, they're trying not to do that. So they lobbied very hard against the bill here in Brazil last spring. Did you all follow closely what happened when they started changing the search, right? So I think that we're going to, one of the reasons it's been so hard to get those kinds of laws in place around the world is that Google has been very good at dividing the journalists from each other. So the small outlets say, well, if we have a bill like this, the big outlets are going to get all the money. We don't want them to get all the money, so we're not going to support it. And this is the reason Australia was able to start their news media bargaining code was, at first the journalist said, well, this isn't going to be fair. Rupert Murdoch has whatever it is, 60-70% of market share. They're going to get all the money. And then the Greens political party said, you know what, it doesn't matter, because even though they get a lot of money, there'll be so much money, the small outlets will get it. And that's what happened in Australia. And I know here in Brazil, you've had some media groups supporting these kinds of bills and some are not. But I think with AI, it's going to be very important to stick together. That is how you are going to be able to extract some money. And companies like OpenAI, as I mentioned, they're in an arms race, and they need to develop these large language models quickly. They want to cut the outsiders, and they need quality content that is not in English. Hello, Spanish. Hello, Portuguese. So I think it's going to be very important for you all collectively to negotiate and try to get money out of these companies. Now, of course, they're going to say to you, we're not making any profit. We can't give you money. But OpenAI's revenues are supposed to be $1 billion a year this year. So they're going to have money. And as I mentioned, the small open source companies, they're just going to steal content. But the big ones, they should be paying. They should pay. Journalism produces a public good. Quality information is necessary for democracy. It is necessary for society, and someone needs to pay for it. And if they're profiting, they should pay their fair share, especially when they're not already paying taxes. So a couple of other things to which I learned because everyone kept asking me is, that when a driverless car has a crash, they don't know why. Do you understand that? With a person, you can say, was it drunk? Was it sending a text message? Was she asleep? Was it raining out? She couldn't see. But when a driverless car hits something, they don't know why. The engineers don't know why. And so it's the same with these large language models. You were mentioning one that links, but mostly, it's so weird. I'm not an engineer. I don't understand it. But they can extract this ideas and information, but they can't explain where they got it from. So this is obviously very risky for journalism, right? And when you think about it, if it's a lie, maybe you could figure out where it came from. But if AP and Global and New York Times and Washington Post and everybody are all reporting, that there was a trial today in Brasilia, how do you know where it came from? So this is part of why this whole question of claiming your content and getting money for your content is going to be incredibly important. They need it, but it's going to be hard to figure it out. So I do, and if you have a paywall, you know that doesn't protect your content either, right? People can just put in a credit card, get behind the paywall, and take it all. The only way to make it illegal is to put in the terms of use, you are not allowed to use this material for training a large language model. Then you can always sue later. But, how many Brazilian outlets have money to sue compared to, a large Silicon Valley tech company? So there's a lot going on here that's going to be really important, I think, for the business model of media outlets. We know they're already struggling. We know that there's news deserts increasing globally. Journalists are losing their jobs all over the place. This is going to be something to really watch out for. I think we can skip the next slide because it more or less says the same thing. Yeah. And we can skip that because I already talked about that. That's great. So what's already happening is in the U.S. is OpenAI is already throwing around money, just like Google and Facebook used to do. They pay for all the conferences, they pay for all the fellowships, they give you all this money to learn how to use their tools. This is already starting to happen in the U.S. So the publishers have been talking about, negotiating together. Some have wanted to, some haven't. Some have said, we don't want to give away our content. We learned the lesson the last time when Rupert Murdoch was the only person who said we should have a paywall. And everyone else said, no, we're going to give it away for free. We'll get more subscribers. And then they didn't as much as they expected. So this time around, people are saying, I don't know if I want to give it away for free. So OpenAI already made a deal with the Associated Press. Don't know how much money. For the archive and for training data for the large language models. New York Times, Guardian, everybody's been talking about negotiating. New York Times, we're going to talk in a minute, has already said they may have to sue OpenAI, so that's already looks like that's falling apart. That was just in the paper a couple weeks ago. And the American Journalism Project, which is a wonderful nonprofit in the U.S. that tries to support local journalism, they just got $5 million from OpenAI. So I wrote to them right away and I said, is that for your content? Because, that doesn't seem like a lot of money. And they said, no, not at all. It's part of, I can't remember what they said. I think it's to help us use AI tools or something. That's how it always starts. And then OpenAI is already funding a center at NYU, which is run by Steve Adler, who's a great guy. I think he was managing editor of Reuters. So it's just like what Google and Facebook started doing, 10, 15 years ago. They're all kind of throwing around money, right? Small amounts of money so they don't have to pay big amounts of money. Thank you. Barry Diller, who I've never met, but I've started listening. Kara Swisher has a podcast where she interviews a lot of these tech people, and she just did an interview with him recently. I think he founded Fox. He owned QVC. Anyway, he is suing to stop content being stolen by the large language models, the AI companies to use in large language models. And he also wants to see a complete updating of copyright legislation. And since Brazil is always ahead of the US, you're already talking about that as well. But he says, realistically, he said on this podcast, American politicians are not about to update copyright legislation. He would like to see an end to fair use. So he's using the courts, which is what we do in America a lot. When we don't regulate, we use the courts instead. So he's suing. He's trying to get other outlets to join, but it doesn't matter if it's a court case. It's not a class action suit. So he's going it alone, and let's see what happens. But he really wants, as he said on the podcast, we have to narrow the copyright law. It's interesting because we didn't, 20 years ago, we all thought, let's keep copyright very open. Countries in the global south, they need access to information. We have to share the knowledge. And now we're like, wait a minute, if it's getting taken over by these big companies that are profiting, we're going to have to narrow it down. So let's see what happens. And let's see if Brazil gets there first. The EU, of course, has copyright directives, but I'm not an expert in those, so I'm not going to talk about them. Okay, go ahead, please. Yeah. We've already started having lawsuits in the U.S., everybody's being sued. Google, Meta, OpenAI. Artists and writers are finding their work unattributed in these large language models. And in August, a federal judge ruled that it cannot be copyrighted. That somebody else, if you create something with this artificial tools, you cannot copyright it. You cannot copyright a false piece of work. So it's going to be an interesting question as to where this goes. Some of this we already talked about, so you can skip ahead. August 16th, the New York Times reported that the New York Times may sue OpenAI. And, when the reporters write about their own publication, they have to call up and get a comment. And what was so interesting was the story said that the federal judges could require destruction of the large language models that include stolen material. That's pretty intense, given that I just mentioned to you that they cost $100 million. And each willful infringement can be fined up to $150,000. So that's a lot of money. And it seems, as I mentioned, that ChatGPT does not have protection from liability. These companies don't. So there could be a lot of interesting legal and economic implications. And if the large language models are destroyed by court order, then they would have to build them up again with legally obtained material. So we're in uncharted territory, as they like to say. We don't know where this is going to go. In Europe, they've been trying to get search engines and news aggregators to pay licensing fees. As you know, Google dropped Spanish news for 8 years because they didn't want to pay for it. They called it a link tax. But because of what's happened in Australia, Google is starting to settle copyright disputes in Europe because they're so worried that the Australian law is going to spread that they are now trying to make deals around the world. In the U.S., we have a proposed law, Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which would be similar to Australia in that it would allow news outlets to collectively negotiate with the platforms for payment. And then, of course, in Australia, the News Media Bargaining Code pushed Google and Facebook to pay for news, and then the outlets, the news publishers, negotiate directly with Google and Facebook, and the small ones are allowed to combine. Does everyone know that Canada now has a law just like Australia? And Facebook has dropped Canadian news. And the city government, federal government, and state governments in Canada have said, well, we're just going to stop advertising in Facebook. So you all know about this. So it's really heating up right now. And I've been very involved in this conversation, so I can talk more about that if you're interested. Okay, want to go ahead? And then we get to my final bit, which is AI and disinformation. And obviously, there's a lot of worry about that and what that's going to mean, especially in 2024 with all the elections. So one thing, as we know, is that the large language models provide huge amounts of false information all the time. So there's plenty of inaccurate. And once they get trained, retraining them is difficult. And the personalization is really the most worrisome. So the idea, Peter Pomerantsev writes about how during the Brexit campaign, with all the micro-targeting, it was possible to email somebody and say, a dog lover. You find a dog lover on Facebook, and then you send them a note saying, well, the EU hates dogs, vote for Brexit because, they're really terrible to dogs. So that kind of thing now with all of this can be much, much, much worse. And so everybody I know who's involved in the sort of disinformation world feels like 2024 in the elections, it's going to be a complete disaster. And I was at the Supreme Court this morning in Brasilia. You can go ahead. And, January 8th is always on everyone's mind. I've been really impressed this week that basically everything I go to starts with people talking about January 8th. It's deeply traumatic. So yeah, as mentioned, this personalized content can be tailored to the data of each user. And so that kind of super micro-targeting, personalized, can become very persuasive, right? I mean, you already, I'm sure, know lots of people who saw some video on YouTube, thought it was true, got outraged, were like ready to run out the door and complain about something. This is going to be much, much worse. Yeah, and of course, images, deepfake images, so it's not just text as well. Another thing, of course, is, and I don't understand why or how, but apparently it's much easier to dox journalists as well, reveal their addresses, get personal information, put it out online. So that will make, you've all been through, as have American journalists, several years of attacks on the press and risks to the physical safety of the press. So this can get even worse. And then, of course, phishing attacks. How many of you have gotten those emails asking you to go buy a gift card? Right? And then you think, oh my God, my boss wants me to go get a gift card, right? So that's the kind of thing that can happen much more. And then there's just the general worry about the sort of general degradation, that people are going to look at all the fake stuff and they're not going to look at the real stuff. And that is just, bad for democracy and bad for society. Go ahead. Yeah, so I think I've already made it clear that, I guess just one thing to add. So the politically motivated disinformation is a danger. And then we also have this other problem, which is that the big platforms are scaling back. So now with Twitter turning into X, owned by Elon Musk, they're just not complying with rules anymore, or even with their own policies. So they've scaled that back. The whole disinformation thing, misinformation on Twitter is much worse now. Facebook has also made various announcements saying, they're not going to punish, they're not going to remove, I think it's election-related mis and disinformation anymore the way they used to. And that was something we were hearing very clearly at the Supreme Court this morning in the Electoral Court, that removals, takedowns in Brazil will have to happen much more quickly in an election cycle. You can't wait 2 days to take something down. It has to be done much more quickly. So I think Brazil may be moving in the different direction than the US or many other parts of the world. Can you move ahead? Yeah, so it reminds me a lot of the sort of early social media days where everyone sort of rushed into this stuff without, pausing. And the companies all promised, hey, it's just going to be fine. Remember, social media is going to bring democracy. It's very wonderful. And now I feel like the world has shifted, even in the US, where we've always been First Amendment, free speech absolutists. There aren't so many of those people around anymore. I think people have seen what's happened and the corrosive effects for democracy. And I think there's more caution and more skepticism than there was 15 years ago. And I would certainly say that's true in Brazil. I was really struck. I was at the UNESCO meetings for Internet Trust in February, and the Brazilian delegation was large and very vocal. And again, I think very traumatized by what had happened on January 8th. Good. So I think we'll stop it right there. Yeah, good. And I'll take any questions that people want to ask. Thank you.
Obrigado. Sugestão é falar o nome e o semestre do curso, tá bom? Yeah.
Hey, Anya. Thank you for coming tonight. I ask for the crowd to be nice to me because I'm kind of nervous for speaking in front of all of you guys. But I want to take a regulatory take of your speech because I thought that was very interesting. You mentioning the effort of the Electoral Court last year trying to limit the widespreading of fake news about the candidates. And if we stop to think, we'll see that next year we'll have an election there in the United States. So I'd like to know if the USA government is thinking about to apply any type of bill to run anything to limit this type of misinformation. Thank you.
That's a great question.
Oh, and just my name. I'm Guilherme Bento, and I'm a third-year journalism student here in ECA-USP.
Oh, fantastic. One of yours, Elizabeth? Thank you. Thank you for the question and for being so brave and speaking English. No, I would say that what has happened in the U.S. is that the whole question of fake news, disinformation has become totally politicized, and you're not even really allowed to use the term fake news anymore because the Republicans say, oh, it's just the Democrats worrying about it. So not only are we not regulating, we're even having a hard time talking about the problem because there's so much polarization. And you know, one of the things I noticed after 2016 was that it was a lot of women that got involved in solving the problem. People like Joan Donovan, Matulina Conde, Claire Wardle, Janet Haven, Renee DiResta, Julia Angwin, Emily Bell, Maria Ressa. Like, it was a lot of women who got into this. Claire Wardle, maybe I can think of 20, Melissa Fleming. And in many cases, what always happens to women, it was a new field. And so it wasn't, fully academically respected. And now it's more established. And Laura Edelson, the Republicans are going after these women. And so they've been holding hearings and they've been subpoenaing the academics. So I have I have colleagues like Camille Francois, Renee DiResta. They're being criticized by Republicans in Congress, and they're being asked to turn over all of their emails. So it's really become a situation where there isn't just it's not just that they disagree on the solutions, it's that the Republicans are turning it into this thing of it doesn't even exist. And during the pandemic, we all had more time at home. We had more time to read and write. And I got very interested in the 1930s. And what happened in the 1930s was there was a journalist who moved to Columbia University and started an anti-propaganda organization, because that's what they used to call, disinformation. And he would send newsletters to school children and talk about how can you tell, like read the newspaper every week, and teachers could work with kids on media literacy and, what are the techniques? A lot of the stuff Claire Wardle was doing, what are the techniques? What are the different categories? What emotions are they appealing to? Stop and think about it. And that group of people against propaganda got very involved in the anti-racist education movement, which was also a big thing in the 1930s. And they said, the worst form of propaganda is racist propaganda. And they started designing curriculum about how, Jews and Muslims and black people. And, this was World War II, right? So people were very, very worried about what was happening around the world. And anyway, long story short, all of this got shut down. And some of the people doing it ended up getting investigated by the Dice Committee, which was the precursor to the McCarthy Committee. So I keep meaning to write an op-ed. When I see these attacks now on the disinformation researchers, I'm like, this is so much like what was happening 100 years ago. But I didn't write about it because I thought everybody knows it, and then it turned out nobody knew about it, so I have to start writing about it. Some of you are nodding, so maybe you're familiar. So that's a long answer, but no, U.S. isn't going to do anything. Do you have anything to add to that? No, I would say. But Brazil will, and you can tell us how that's working out. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Paloma. I am a first-year student. I have a question a little bit more on the universe of labor, and it is about, if the regulations concerning AI don't advance as much as we hope it will, do you think AI checking, humans checking AI-generated information could be the new big soulless corporate job? That's a concern I personally have as an office worker. Thank you.
That's such a great question. A few years ago, I wrote a report on startups that were trying to use AI to identify misinformation. And I interviewed people from like 20 different companies to see, did they have a business model? Was it going to work? Was Facebook going to buy them? This was when we thought, well, Facebook and Google really care, and they're going to try to develop new technology to stop this. And so then about 3 years later, about 2 years ago, someone suggested to me, why don't you go back and see what happened? And so I turned it into a capstone for my students, which was really fun, because then it was a nice project. We could all do these interviews, and then we could write up. And to my sort of surprise, everyone said, you know what? It turns out we were wrong. People like fake information, I interviewed Munir Ibrahim at TruePic. He said, think about all the dating websites. Like, of course, it's all fake now. So it turned out there wasn't. So I'm not sure. You may not have to worry about getting a job like that, because there may not be a job like that, because people may not care. But there has been some interesting coverage of, we've all read about the content moderators when Facebook outsources, like to that company Samad, and the whistleblower Daniel Moteng, the South African in Kenya, who last time I saw him, he still didn't have a job. So that was pretty terrible. But apparently now Scale, this AI company in the U.S., is actually using underpaid Kenyans to do all the work, like identifying what is a bicycle. So I guess there will be some exploitation like that. Are there Brazilians working in this area too?
No.
Yeah.
But I think will be very, very needed here in Brazil, because the content moderators here are regulated by Facebook or Google inside the company, not outside. And without a code of conduct, this problem, yeah.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that. I have one student who's always reminding us that social media is on the backs of a lot of unpaid workers around the world. Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Gabriel Tavares, or just Gabriel. Well, I'm a student here the second year or fourth semester. I would like to know your thoughts about the situation in Canada. Because as you mentioned, on social media, on Australia, they have made a lot of agreements to pay for the news. They have made agreements with newsrooms. But when you look at Canada's situation, they have shifted their approach entirely. They have blocked the news. So my fear is that when you come to other countries trying to regulate them, just like Brazil, they could do the same thing here. They could block, because you've seen the big lobby they had to push the regulation they were going to vote. So what do you think is going to happen to other countries?
Yeah, so I think, and I'm so glad you asked me that question. I could talk about this for a long time. I think, by the way, that the Brazilian draft bill has a must-carry provision, which says that the platforms cannot punish the publishers by dropping the news, I think. Yeah, so here's what's going on around the world. Google does not want to see these spread. And they're doing two things. They're making separate deals with publishers, and they are threatening. So I was in Italy in May, met with someone from the government, and Google had gone to the Italian government and said, we're going to drop Italian news. So they're doing this everywhere. And they can, they probably can do it with smaller markets. I don't think they can do it with Brazil, because Brazil is so big. South Africa, the Competition Commission opened up an inquiry in March, I think. And the publishers in South Africa are so desperate, they can't wait 3 years for a law. So they're all now positioning themselves, talking to Google and trying to get money out of them. I think Facebook is dropping news. I mean, I've never felt that these codes would be a permanent solution. I think maybe it's for just a few years, but I still think that they should pay. They've gotten away with this for years. So Canada, for sure, I think they'll have to cave and pay out some money. Taiwan, they've just created a $3 million fund for journalism, which is nothing. But again, it's a way of trying to stop the codes. So I'm working on a really interesting project right now. So as you know, what Google and Facebook have always said to publishers is, we bring you traffic, even though they don't always say the numbers, and you should convert that into subscribers. And if you can't convert that into subscribers, that is your fault. Right? Isn't that more or less it? So the way I explain to my students is the muffin. And it's so funny, everyone's starting to know my muffin. Patricia Campos Mayos the other day was like laughing in South Africa. You're laughing, you know the muffin? Okay, imagine you sell delicious blueberry muffins with crusty tops. Somebody comes along every day and they take the top, and you are left with the little dry part at the bottom, and you cannot sell it. Is that your fault? I don't think so, right? Economists call that cream skimming. So, yeah.
Just to give you the idea of what Google said here in Brazil about this kind of, we are going to cut your nose and so on, in an event with journalists in Brazil, big event, they said, we don't need you, you need us.
Right, exactly. So that's what they go around saying. And there are a lot of publisher associations right now that are trying to figure out how can you value what Google is getting. And that's tough because Google and Facebook don't particularly provide the data that you need. So when I was in Zurich in May, I read about a study that the Swiss publishers had commissioned from a behavioral economist consultancy, and I went to visit them to find out what their methodology was. And they created a Google with no news, and they had two groups of users. And what happened was they found that the Google with the users didn't use the Google with no news very much. So they said, okay, Google is getting value from the news. And then the question is, how much of that value should be given to the publishers, right? And their estimate was 40%. And so I think they came up with a number that Swiss publishers should be getting something like 160 million Swiss francs a year. You know that in Australia it was about 200 million US a year, 200 million Australian a year. It's about 140 million. So globally, a benchmark is emerging. And I would strongly recommend to Brazilian publishers that they hire one of these firms and they get a big number and then they start negotiating. I just want to add two things about the bargaining code. One is I am working with a group of economists right now, and we're finishing our study on what we think Google and Facebook owe US publishers. And there has already been a study of that done. I spoke to the people who did that study, but I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So what's going to be different about our study is we're academics, so we're going to release the number and we're going to release the methodology. Yep. So Barry Nailbuff, the Yale game theorist, has written a book called Split the Pie, and our approach is that when two sides work together, they create value. And so the question is, how much of that value has been created? And how much of that should be shared? And you can look at things like licensing agreements, other deals that have been made public, and you can come up with the benchmark. Again, the Swiss consultancy thinks it should be 40% go to the publishers, but that's what we're working on. I sent it out for peer review a couple weeks ago. They're revising it right now. They just texted me while I was on the plane. As I keep saying, I'm really scared. Like, Google's going to be horrible to me. When I mentioned Brazil in an article in May, within an hour, I got an email from Google, someone I'd never met, wrote, "Hey, Anya, I want a correction." I was like, oh my God. Do I know this person? Like, I literally went through my email. I was like, do I know you? Nobody calls me, "Hey, Anya." And then I was like, I'm sorry, have we met? I'm just getting on a plane. She was like, okay, just give me your editor's name. I'll call them if that's easier. Oh. I know. Can you imagine? From Google, because I said that Google manipulated search in Brazil and they didn't like the word manipulated. But I know. I said to my husband, what do they care? Manipulated, tamper, what does it matter? So I don't know, maybe if they're, maybe if you're suing or something. So that's what we're doing, is we're going to issue our report in a couple weeks. Watch out if you see a lot of nasty things about Anya Schiffrin doesn't know anything. I'm sure that'll be from Google. Look out for that. Maybe you could even send a nice little tweet going, she's really nice or something. I have no idea. But the other thing I wanted to say was, I'm at a policy school and I'm very pragmatic. So I believe what Dean Baker, the economist, said to me once. I said, what should we support? Should we support vouchers for subscriptions? Should we support tax credits? Like, what should we do? And Dean said, the best policy is the policy you can do. So that's my take on the bargaining codes. Not perfect, but it was money for journalism from big companies that owe money. Very simple. But not perfect. So what we did in South Africa in July, and maybe you heard about it because there were a lot of Brazilians in the room and Argentines and all kinds of people from Africa and Asia, was we came up with some global principles that we would like to see countries adopt when they do these bargaining code laws. So the first thing we'd really like to see is transparency. Australia, Google got everyone to sign non-disclosure agreements. Canada's improved because what they said is the amounts have to be reported every year to the regulator. So we would like to see some transparency. And in South Africa, they said, no, we can't do that. We could be accused of collusion, but hopefully there's a way. Second thing we really would like is guarantees that the money goes to journalism. In America, we have all of these hedge funds that have bought newspapers, and we're all like, well, we don't want them to get all the money. And then we're sort of debating, well, if they spend it on journalism, is that okay? But we definitely don't want them to spend it on like a raise for the publisher. And of course, the Scandinavians have been giving money to journalism for years, and they're very, very good at criteria and are you how much content are you publishing? So that's the kind of thing we're thinking about. And then the third thing is we want to make sure that the small outlets get money as well as the big ones. Doesn't have to be distorting. Doesn't mean they have to get more than the big ones. If the big ones are bigger, fair enough. But some kind of inclusiveness to make sure that everybody's included. So those are our global principles. And I wrote about them. I think Patricia Campos Mayo was there. I bet some Brazilian journalists wrote about it as well. You probably saw something, and my piece is on Pointer. So yeah, you're nodding. Everyone's ready. You guys are a very well-informed audience. Anyway, that's me on the bargaining codes for now.
Do we have time for one last question?
Of course.
Ok. Já vou me desculpando com as outras pessoas. A Anya, she's under a very tight schedule, so one last question, and we wrap up with Beth.
Great.
First off, hello.
Hello.
My name is Arthur Maciel. I am from Pontifica Universidade Católica. First off, I'm very sorry and very nervous. And second off, I want to talk about digital colonialism. It's a thing that you mentioned Google.
Sorry, talk about what was that?
Digital colonialism.
Oh, okay. Yes, go for it.
And you mentioned Google, and it's something that I'm personally very concerned about. Wow.
It's okay. Take a breath. Yeah, you're good.
And I'm very concerned about. In one way, that big data mostly use a system of observing data that is going from to United States.
Yes.
Here in Brazil, most of our data, I recite about SUS, our medical, I forgot the word, health system. Most of our data, most of our information are in American data institutions. And I want to talk about, I want to receive your opinion about that, about how this damages media.
Absolutely. I just want to start by saying that I used to get so nervous public speaking, and it was terrible when I was a journalist. Like at a press conference, it would be so hard to ask a question. And I think the only reason I got more comfortable was from teaching and being in a classroom with my students. But now you can see I'm not nervous today. So it's really practice makes it easier. So I think that's great that you tried. I have a friend who actually joined Toastmasters, and they forced her to give a speech every single month. So just keep practicing. I think that's great, especially a foreign language too. You don't want to hear my Spanish. I am half Spanish, but my Spanish isn't great. So, I feel like women academics or women in general, we don't like to talk about things we're not experts on, and I don't feel like I'm an expert on this subject. So I don't want to give you a very long answer. I'm not sure about like how all of it works. I do remember with Marco Civil that was a big discussion, was localization of data, and was it actually physically possible to keep the data in Brazil, and how does that work? I feel like I'm not the expert on the engineering, but I think that you're totally right to be worried about it. I think that's part of the debate in the US right now with TikTok is, how much of our data is going to China. Part of it, of course, is protectionism. And I think that Brazil has probably a stronger privacy law than we do, right? Or not?
Not at all.
I mean, because we have the California privacy law, which is modeled on the German data protection.
No.
The European,
Our legislation is good, protection of the person, the
Personal data.
the personal data, but it's not well regulated, so we have problems.
That's what I was going to
Yeah,
say. I think that's been the problem globally.
Yeah.
Is that it's not enforced, and it's very, very hard to get compliance. Like, if you go into a drugstore in New York City, you're tracked by like 17 different companies. Yeah.
Yes, here it's not,
right?
now it's
They're
here
looking to see, are you looking at the aspirin or are you looking at the cold medicine? So we have, Shoshana Zubokoff has written about the surveillance capitalism.
Yes.
And that,
I've read
that is
it.
our situation, right? All our data exhausts. So I think you're right to be worried, and I'm sorry that I don't have the technical expertise to give you a solution, except to say that I think we need more and better enforcement of privacy regulation. So I hope that helps. Great. Any
It's
closing?
okay. Yes. Thank you. It was very fruitful content for us, and I hope after this we can establish a real partnership, especially women, academics, women. And now I'm going to speak in Portuguese to them. Obrigado pela presença de vocês. Uma pena que a gente não teve tempo de colocar mais questões, mas saibam que tudo que foi tratado aqui são pontos de bastante preocupação e de necessidade de introdução destas discussões no correr das suas disciplinas, né? Ou seja, a gente tem espaço para essa discussão. Nosso grupo de pesquisa, o COM+, está à disposição para esta discussão, na medida em que vocês sintam necessidade de um dia sentar todo mundo e vamos escolher um tema e vamos falar a respeito, fazer uma reunião assim, estamos à disposição. O professor Rodrigo é do nosso grupo de pesquisa e ele faz esta ponte maravilhosamente bem. Então, acho que a presença de vocês aqui abre todo um campo para novas discussões e é muito importante, porque são vocês que vão estar já no mercado, trabalhando e discutindo e vivenciando estes pontos que são muito fortes na sociedade atual. Tá bom? Muito obrigada, Anya, muito obrigada, Jason, e ficamos à disposição.
São Paulo, newspaper here.
Pessoal, um último recado aqui da Júnior, por favor.
Para quem não fez a inscrição, a gente deixou aqui um QR Code na saída do auditório, na parede lá fora. Quem muito importante que faça a inscrição, tá? E coloca um e-mail que vocês utilizam para a gente poder mandar depois o certificado. Por favor, quem utilizou o aparelho de tradução simultânea, faz o retorno aqui na saída para a Laísa e a gente vai devolver documentos de vocês, tá? Por favor, não saiam sem devolver o aparelho. E é isso, gente. Obrigado, boa noite.
Documento para newspapers.